He wore a mask to destroy a kingdom, but beneath it, the flesh rotted, the mind broke, and the soul begged for hell's release. In the dim, frost-laced streets of early 17th century London, shadows whispered the names of traitors, heretics, and ghosts. Beneath the spires of Westminster and the rotting beams of the Tower, a single man, now a symbol, once a conspirator, lay mangled by iron, abandoned by allies, and ravaged by time. His name was Guy Fawkes, but by the end, not even he would recognize the face in the mirror of his own torment. What began as an explosive dream to shatter tyranny ended in the slow decay of skin, sanity, and soul. This is not the legend of the gunpowder plot. This is the death of the man who failed to burn a king, and instead burned in silence. It began in the dark, not the quiet dark of sleep, but the oppressive dark that chokes the lungs and closes in on the skull like a stone tomb, a darkness thick with damp mildew and ancient rot, where rats moved like whispers across gunpowder barrels, and the scent of sulfur clung to every breath like the stench of burnt flesh. The cellar beneath the House of Lords was no place for a man to die, but worse, it was where dreams came to rot, where revolution curdled in its cradle, where hope, soaked in oil and trembling with the threat of fire, was smothered by bootsteps and betrayal. Guy Fawkes knelt in the filth, fingers cramped around a match, nails blackened with soot and grime, lips moving in silent rhythm, not in prayer, but in counting, as though the moment might still come when time itself would rupture, and the monarchy above him would explode in a divine conflagration of bone, velvet, and sanctimonious screams. But the steps came sooner, louder, real. The door creaked open with the shriek of rust and fate, and torchlight spilled into the chamber like judgment, catching his gaunt face in a halo of flame. There were shouts, orders barked, steel drawn, curses flung like stones. But Fawkes didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't rise. He simply looked up with a gaze that belonged to someone already halfway into the grave. When they seized him, it was not with the trembling awe reserved for monsters, but the revulsion one might show a corpse that had begun to weep pus. His wrists were yanked behind his back with such force that sinew strained and tore, and the iron manacles bit deep into skin already split by cold and labor, grinding bone against rust. The soldiers, smelling of horse sweat, pipe ash, and Protestant righteousness, spat in his face and called him a son of Jezebel, a blasphemer, a satanic cockroach hiding beneath God's altar. One of them kicked him in the gut, not as punishment, but as a casual cruelty, like a man stamping out a firework that fizzled too soon. Fawkes doubled over, the air leaving his lungs in a wet hiss that tasted of blood and bile. They dragged him up the stone stairs, his boots scraping against the edge of each step, leaving a streak of filth and blood that gleamed in the torchlight like a trail of failure. Above ground, the wind of that November morning bit with the precision of razors, carving through his threadbare coat and into his marrow, and the sky hung low and gray, like a lid fastened down over the city, coffin-like and breathless. As they pulled him into the street, the mob swelled, bloated with righteous hatred and fear, their cries rising like a hymn of condemnation, faces twisted into grotesque masks, women clutching their children, men lifting stones, old crones muttering curses under their breath. Someone threw a handful of mud mixed with manure. It struck his cheek and clung there like judgment. They paraded him through the heart of London like a trophy of horror, the embodiment of treason's wages. But beneath the jeering and the stones, there was also a murmur, a hush, a flicker of dread in the eyes of those who wondered what had driven this man to such depths, what whispered in his ears in the long silence before he struck the match, what demons he had invited into his heart when he chose flame over faith. In that moment, the crowd saw not only a failed assassin, but something worse, a man who believed too much. When the Lord Chamberlain demanded his name, his reply was delivered through cracked lips and blood-slicked teeth, the words rolling slow and deliberate like sacrament laced with poison. "John Johnson," he said, a falsehood worn like armor, a lie that held no power, and yet in that instant, it was all he had left to give. They struck him across the mouth for insolence, splitting his lip and sending a fresh ribbon of red down his chin. He smiled again, That grim, flickering smile of a man who has already accepted damnation and wonders if perhaps hell might be quieter than the streets of London. The tower loomed on the horizon, its jagged silhouette cutting into the sky like the crown of a dead god. And as the gates creaked open to swallow him whole, Guy Fawkes turned his face toward the heavens. He did not weep. He did not pray. But somewhere in the depths of his shattered ribs, a single thought pulsed like a dying ember. Better to be ash beneath the altar than dust beneath the throne. He did not yet know how slowly a man could burn without flame, but he would learn. Beneath the bowels of the Tower of London, where mold blooms like sin on the walls and centuries of blood seep silently into the stone, there lies a chamber that does not know daylight, only the dull shimmer of torchlight trembling on sweat-slick iron, and the endless echo of human suffering folded into its mortar like some dark communion. Here, where rats scurry across chains rusted by decades of weeping, Guy Fawkes was delivered like a beast for sacrifice, his body still bearing the grime of capture, his lips crusted with dried blood and mockery, his eyes sunk into sockets bruised purple with exhaustion and silent fury. The room smelled of everything the world tries to forget, a rank, cloying stew of unwashed flesh, old feces, vomit-soaked straw, and something metallic that clung to the tongue. Blood, fresh and long dead, both whispering the same tale. Flickering torches spat smoke into the stale air, casting monstrous shadows on the damp walls, shadows that twisted and flailed like the spirits of those who had once screamed here and never left. Outside, the wind moaned like a dying prayer, but in here, all that remained was the drip of stagnant water and the quiet rattling of chains awaiting another name. He was stripped slowly, deliberately, the fabric peeling away like dead skin, revealing the pale, shivering flesh of a man not yet 35, but aged already by despair and cold. The soldiers did not speak to him. They spoke over him, around him, as though he were livestock or worse, something beneath language. When he was placed upon the rack, his limbs were pulled taut with an almost reverent precision, each crank of the winch a creaking hymn to dislocation. The pain came not in sudden bursts, but in steady crescendos. Tendons stretched beyond design, joints beginning to hum with impossible pressure, his spine arching into an unnatural curve that felt like the hand of God himself, twisting his body into a question mark. The interrogators began to speak, not in rage, but with cold patience. Who funded the conspiracy? Who betrayed the crown? Name them all. Their voices were calm, almost liturgical, as if reciting from some sacred script, while his muscles tore like wet parchment beneath their ceremony. When he refused, because he must, because the cause still smoldered in the corners of his mind like embers clinging to ash, the rack answered for him. Another turn, another scream, another crack that echoed like thunder in a tomb. His fingernails began to split. Blood dripped from his ears. His bladder emptied without warning, warm and shameful beneath him, soaking the wooden planks as one of the guards crossed himself and whispered that the devil was being squeezed out of him, inch by inch. His back spasmed in waves that no prayer could still, and soon his jaw clenched so tightly that molars cracked, splintering like dry bone beneath a blade. And still he refused, not because he believed he would be saved, not because he believed he would be remembered, but because silence was the only dignity left to a man whose body was no longer his own. In his delirium, visions came, not of saints or angels, but of fire swallowing the parliament whole, of kings screaming as their entrails danced with the flames, of a city finally silenced beneath divine detonation. Then the faces shifted, the fire turned inward, licking at his veins, and his mother wept beside his burnt corpse, her hands unable to recognize what he had become. There were moments when he hallucinated that the torturers' faces melted into masks, goat-headed priests with black eyes, whispering scriptures not in Latin, but in the howls of hell's choir. They told him this pain was prophecy. They told him he was Judas and also Christ, that he had lit a match meant for God, and now God demanded his marrow in return. Some of the guards refused to look at him after the second day. One servant, a young boy tasked with mopping the straw, claimed he saw devils circling the rack, whispering in tongues, their breath freezing the torches to blue. A priest came and tried to offer him last rites, but Fawkes laughed, a low, broken, choking sound, and told him there was no God in this place, only men with knives who wear crosses like masks. But the worst pain, worse than the tendon snapping, worse than the teeth biting through his own tongue, was the creeping, paralyzing awareness that his death would change nothing, that the king would live, that the church would triumph, that no empire ever truly crumbles from one man's fire, that his cause, his comrades, his courage would rot in the same silence that now filled his lungs between each scream. By the end of the fourth day, Guy Fawkes no longer looked human. His arms hung limp from the sockets, shoulders grotesquely dislocated, skin blistered and torn, face swollen into an unrecognizable mask of blood and fever. His eyes, once sharp and defiant, now rolled back into his skull in fits of unconsciousness, broken only by screams that no longer sounded like words. He did not sleep. He did not rest. He existed in a blur of agony, prophecy, and the distant memory of a cause already dying. And when they finally paused, not from mercy, but calculation, he lay motionless, drooling onto the wood, praying not for salvation, but for a final flame, for one spark to set his body alight and end the long betrayal of being made to survive. For here, in the crucible of flesh and failure, Guy Fawkes was not executed. He was unraveled. The chamber into which Guy Fawkes was dragged reeked of a slow death, not the clean, sterile end found in dreams, but the rotting, fevered kind that seeps from the skin before the soul has even departed. The scent was thick, the waxy sweat of fear that clung to the stone walls like old sin, the curdled breath of men too long denied sleep and mercy, and the sour sting of ink, fresh and black and waiting to damn. Light bled from trembling candles, their flames stuttering in the damp draft that groaned through the tower's bones like the breath of a buried god. Fawkes could no longer walk unaided. His legs, once those of a soldier, now hung beneath him like meat half carved from the bone, trembling with every step as though each joint had forgotten the art of motion. Two guards, their expressions drained of anything but duty, held him beneath the arms like one might carry a scarecrow fallen from its post, his head lolling, hair matted with blood and sweat, mouth open in a silent, feverish gasp. His breath came in shallow hisses, each inhalation like drawing shards of glass into collapsed lungs, and yet he was still alive, grotesquely, cruelly alive. The punishment not yet complete, the spectacle still unfolding. The table was already prepared. A single sheet of parchment, pale as a death shroud, laid neatly between two flickering candles, the quill beside it glinting with wet ink like a dagger freshly drawn from a throat. And behind the desk stood the Inquisitor, robed in the authority of the crown and the sanctimony of Scripture, eyes hidden in shadow, voice low and serpentine, as he welcomed Guy Fawkes to his moment of betrayal. The man did not shout. He did not curse. Instead, he spoke in the tones of a confessor, of a man who believed himself a vessel of justice, but whose words cut deeper than any blade. They sat Fawkes down upon a splintered stool, and his broken body collapsed into it like water poured into a cracked bowl. The quill was pressed into his ruined hand, a hand that once held fuses, blades, the dreams of revolution. Now nothing but a claw of ruptured tendons and yellowed nails, trembling so violently that the feather trembled with it, as if recoiling in horror at the task it had been given. He stared at the parchment. The blankness mocked him. It was not merely a space for names. It was a tomb, not for bodies, but for loyalty, for belief, for everything he had whispered in the dark when the world still made sense. The voices came again, not just from the men in the room, but from the places within his skull that had fractured during the agony of the rack. They chanted in unison, "Confess, name, damn, confess, name, damn." His mother's voice called out from somewhere in the mortar, sobbing that she could not bear to see him hang. He saw Thomas Wintour dangling from a scaffold, his face black and bloated, his tongue split like a serpent's. He saw the Parliament explode in reverse, the fire sucked back into the earth, unlit, undone, the vision erased like chalk beneath cold rain. The quill touched paper. The ink spread like a wound, wide and uncontrolled, as his name, once bold and sure, carved into secret letters and whispered promises, scrawled itself across the page in spasms. The G in Guido wavered, shook, collapsed into itself. The F in Fawkes bled down the parchment like a vein split open. It was no signature. It was a surrender, a map of pain etched in ink, drawn by a hand that no longer remembered what it was fighting for. The Inquisitor leaned forward, voice as soft as a prayer and twice as cruel. And the others? Names, faces, shadows. The devil, they say, asks only for one soul, but the crown demanded them all. Fawkes's lips moved, dry and peeling, teeth clicking together like rotting ivory. He spoke, not with conviction, not with fear, but with the numbness of a man who had been hollowed out, his voice brittle and gray, like a moth crumbling to dust in a dying flame. He gave them what they wanted, not because he believed them worthy, not because he thought it would save him, but because he was already gone. Only his body remained, a ruined cathedral whose altar had long since collapsed. And so the confession was written, not just in letters and lines, but in the bloodied shiver of his hand, in the yellow phlegm he coughed onto the table, in the piss-soaked rags beneath him. The parchment bore the collapse of Guy Fawkes, not the explosion he had planned, but a quiet, unspectacular ruin, the kind that leaves no song behind. When it was done, they took the paper from his fingers so curled and crippled they had to be pried open with iron, and nodded solemnly, as though a great truth had been uncovered. One of the guards crossed himself. Another muttered that Satan had finally lost. But as they dragged him away, Fawkes laughed, a thin, ragged whisper that sounded more like coughing than joy, but was joy nonetheless. For even in this final indignity, some feral part of him clung to the irony that the only fire he had truly kindled was within the minds of those who now feared what a single man, even broken, might ignite. In the shadow of parchment and prophecy, Guy Fawkes became history's ink, spilled, black, and unforgiven. The morning of January the 31st, in the year of our Lord 1606, crept into Westminster not with the hush of reverence, but with the grim inevitability of a final act rehearsed too often, a ritual soaked in centuries of gore, a public theater in which flesh was both spectacle and sermon. The sky above bore no light, only the bloated swell of cloud and mist, low and sodden like the breath of some sated beast, its mouth still wet with the meat of martyrs and madmen alike. Guy Fawkes, or what remained of him, was hauled into the yard by arms that could barely bear their own weight, let alone the burden of a man turned more ruin than body. His skin hung from his frame in sallow folds, split in places where the rack had torn the muscle from the bone, and his face, once sharp with conviction, had collapsed into a swollen mask of bruises, crusted blood, and sunken fever. Yet even so, his eyes flickered with a dull light, not defiance, not hope, but a slow-burning ember of awareness that he was being transformed, not executed, made not merely to die, but to be displayed, unraveled, and scattered like the entrails of a cursed animal left as warning at a temple gate. The sentence was not whispered nor handed down in a dusty chamber. It was read aloud, in front of the crowd, in front of the crows, perched like judges atop the gibbets and gallows, in front of wives clutching their children by the ears and priests crossing themselves with hands that trembled beneath their cassocks. The words rang out like iron bells, each syllable a nail in the coffin of whatever dignity he had left, to be drawn, hanged, disemboweled, quartered, and burned, in the name of the King, the Church, and the Holy Order of England's eternal grace. They lashed him to the hurdle, a rough wooden frame dragged by a gaunt horse, its ribs visible through mange and muck, and pulled him through the city like refuse. The wheels creaked a dirge over cobblestones slick with frost and ordure, and his body jolted with every rut in the road, his legs trailing behind him like forgotten limbs, splintered and dragged raw. The crowd erupted, not in solemn mourning, but in a pageantry of hatred, their mouths twisted by cold and cruelty. They hurled dung, piss, chunks of frozen bread. They screamed for his soul, for his silence, for their own salvation through the agony of another. And all the while, bells tolled in time with the whip crack of executioners' laughter, and smoke coiled from the chimneys like the ghosts of other men who had died screaming beneath this same sky. At the gallows, he was lifted, not reverently, but as one might hoist a slaughtered boar, and looped into the noose, his spine bent backward, arms dangling like broken wings. The crowd fell to a hush as the rope pulled taut, and for a moment, silence swelled. Not out of mercy, but anticipation. His body jerked, convulsed, the flesh of his neck stretching, eyes bulging, feet kicking out with the last instincts of a body desperate to remain whole. But the hangman was careful. This was not to be a clean death. He was cut down before the blackness could consume him fully, and the gasp that erupted from his throat was not a sound but a ragged wound, a wet retch of breath, bile, and blood. His lips split, his bowels loosened, and as they laid him out upon the wooden scaffold, flies already circled. The knife came next, not a swift blade, but a crude instrument sharpened on stones darkened by other entrails. The executioner, hands caked in soot and sanctimony, muttered the name of God as he plunged the blade into the soft of Fawkes' abdomen, and the scream that erupted was less a cry of pain than of revelation, the sound a soul makes when it realizes hell is real and shaped like the hands of men. The intestines spilled forth in steaming coils, glistening with blood and mucus, pulled slowly from his gut like cursed rosary beads, stretched and displayed before his face while his body thrashed in convulsion. And then, still breathing, still watching, still aware, his genitals were hacked from him, not as punishment, but as purification. The blood sprayed in dark arcs across the wood onto the boots of the priest who murmured absolution with trembling hands, as if even heaven would be hesitant to receive what now remained. He did not die then. They cut out his heart last, lifted it skyward in a trembling fist as the executioner proclaimed, "Behold the heart of a traitor!" And only then did his body still, a shudder running down the spine like the last flicker of a candle before smoke. His corpse was quartered with wet, cracking thuds, limbs split and strewn like meat for wolves, and his head, bruised, eyeless, mouth agape, was hoisted high atop a pike, where the wind whistled through the teeth and the crows came to roost. And so the man who had once dreamed of burning Parliament to ash was himself rendered into cinders, not in an explosion, but in pieces, in filth, in blood. Not a martyr, not even a villain, just a cautionary offering left at the altar of order, beneath the gaze of a crown too afraid to let his memory fade quietly. They scattered his body to the city's gates. But his name, they could not quarter that. Not truly, not forever. The scaffold loomed like a crucifix carved from gallows wood, rough and splintered, soaked with centuries of lamentation, its base dark with the memories of blood long dried and forgotten, though never truly gone. The air was colder here. A wind rolled in from the Thames with the weight of rot and river bone, howling between the stone walls of Westminster Yard like the shriek of some ancient god, blind and furious, calling for another soul to settle a debt too old for memory. Guy Fawkes, dragged now like a marionette whose strings were tangled in agony, could barely feel his feet beneath him. They were numbed not just by the frost, but by the torment etched into every ligament, every tendon, every nerve that had been twisted into a map of suffering. His body no longer belonged to him. It was a vessel for spectacle, a symbol hollowed out by pain, stitched together with humiliation and the damp threads of fever dreams. His robe, if it could still be called that, clung to his frame like wet paper, stained with blood, vomit, and the pale yellow stench of human waste. His spine bent unnaturally, not from reverence, but collapse, each step forward echoing with the sound of joints grinding against their sockets like teeth in a clenched jaw. The crowd had already gathered, a throng of the pious and the bloodthirsty, of mothers pressing prayers into their children's ears while urging them to look upon the face of treason, of priests muttering litanies through clenched teeth, their eyes darting toward the gray heavens as if expecting divine fire to strike the scaffold and purify it of the sin it was about to consume. Their breath clouded the air like incense, mixing with the scent of tallow smoke and charred fat still lingering from yesterday's hanging. Above them, the crows circled, black as judgment, waiting, always waiting. He saw it all. The scaffold, the executioner's apron, stiff with dried gore, the ropes hanging like serpents from the frame, their knots tied not for death, but for torment prolonged. The axe, glinting beneath a dusting of frost, not destined for his neck, not yet, but a reminder, a blade of memory, of what might have been if mercy ever ruled men. He climbed the steps, or rather was hauled, his arms slung around the shoulders of guards who winced at the stench of him, at the heat still radiating from wounds that festered despite the cold. Each step was a sacrament of suffering. His knee buckled, the bone clicking audibly, and someone in the crowd gasped, not in sympathy, but thrill. His breath rasped like parchment torn in two. And as he stood, or sagged, or was made to appear upright, the priest came forward, hand trembling, Bible open to a verse he could not read for weeping, lips moving too slowly to catch up to the dying. And Guy Fawkes, who had once dreamed of a holy fire, who had carried 36 barrels of vengeance into the bones of Parliament, now looked up, not to the sky, but into the eyes of the man who would kill him, and saw only exhaustion there. No hatred, no righteousness, just the dull fatigue of another man asked to feed the machine. He did not wait for the rope to tighten. He did not wait for the crowd to cheer. He stepped, he leapt, not with grace, not with grandeur, but with the broken elegance of a man who still had one freedom left: the freedom to fall. The crack of his neck splitting against the scaffold's edge echoed like a drum roll cut short, and for one instant the world stilled. The crowd gasped, a tide of voices sucking inward, a sea of shock, of disappointment. They had come for entrails, for dismemberment, for screams. But what they saw instead was a corpse slumped at the base of the scaffold, the mouth slack and open, the eyes rolled back in a mockery of divine revelation. Yet the sentence did not end with his breath. They carved him anyway, out of law, out of hatred, out of the need to fulfill a promise of horror. His abdomen was sliced open like a beast at slaughter, and though he no longer screamed, the act itself carried its own voice, the sound of flesh parting, of viscera steaming in the winter air, of death being finished long after the soul had gone. His limbs were severed, the blade hacking through bone and tendon with the finality of a closing door, and his head, swollen, broken, half caved from the fall, was mounted high above the crowd on a pike blackened with other names, other faces. They burned his genitals, as they had vowed, and the smoke that rose from the fire curled upward like a twisted prayer, not to heaven, but to memory. For in death, Guy Fawkes had escaped their theater, but they still made him a warning, a faceless relic, a voiceless mask, a name hammered into ash. And as the smoke of his unholy purification climbed into the gray sky, some swore they heard thunder roll behind the clouds, not from storm, but from something older, something watching, something remembering. The fire starter had fallen, but the fire had not. The tower kept no monument. The river carried no trace. Even the pike that bore his head rotted before his name did, and yet he remains. Not in the way he hoped, not in revolution's dawn or justice's triumph, but as a mask, a costume, a firework sold in cellophane, lit by the same hands that would have jeered as his intestines steamed in winter air. A ghost emptied of meaning and repurposed for celebration. His story sanded down until it no longer bleeds, no longer stinks, no longer bites. What began as a prayer wrapped in powder ended in entrails wrapped around law. What was meant to bring judgment became instead a spectacle, a ritual of control, masked as justice, filmed in screams. And so, every November, beneath the crackle of sparklers and the roar of rockets splitting the sky, beneath mulled wine and childhood giggles, there lingers the ghost of a man who tried to set the world alight, and instead was burned as fuel to keep it as it was. His name became legend, but his body became a warning. And the fire he lit, it did not consume the corrupt, it consumed him.